Jesus told the disciples a parable about the need to pray always and not to lose heart. Well, we've plenty to lose heart over at the moment, haven't we? Russia and the Ukraine, the climate crisis, the low turnout at our city elections last week, rising prices, personal things about jobs or families or health. Losing heart is something we know about. And the community that Luke was writing for knew about losing heart as well. Jesus had not returned as they had expected. Persecutions were rising. What was the future of their community to be? And then that gnarly question that haunts all people of faith: why is it that God does not answer our prayers when Jesus promised things like, ask and it will be given you, seek and you will find? Seems like a fairly straightforward promise. How come it doesn't seem to get fulfilled? So Luke brings us a parable to try and answer that question, which is a vivid picture of an encounter between a widow and a judge. Remember that widows, first of all, were seen to be in need of protection by the community as they had no husband, and if they were misfortunate enough not to have a son as well, then they had no one to look after them. And in particular, they had no one to speak up for them in court if that was required, because women, of course, couldn't speak in court. But this widow goes herself to see the judge. Now, judges were supposed to protect the needs of the widow and the orphan, as outlined countless times in the Hebrew scriptures, but often the judges were corrupt, and prophets like Amos were always calling them out. We have a wonderful description that illustrates this parable that comes many centuries later from Iraq, but nonetheless pretty much tells the same story. An English writer was travelling in Iraq in the late 1800s, and he wrote this: I went into the ancient city of Nisibis in Mesopotamia. Immediately on entering the city, on one side there stood a prison with its barred windows, and opposite was a large open hall, the court of justice of the place. On a slightly raised dais at the far end sat the qadi, or the judge, half buried in cushions. Around him squatted various secretaries and other notables. The populace crowded into the rest of the hall, a dozen voices clamouring at once that his cause should be first heard. The more prudent litigants joined not in the fray, but held whispered communications with the secretaries, passing bribes, euphemistically called fees, into the hands of one or the other. When the greed of the underlings was satisfied, one of them would whisper to the qadi, who would promptly call such and such a case. It seemed to be ordinarily taken for granted that the judgment would go for the litigant who had paid the highest price. But meantime, a poor woman on the skirts of the crowd perpetually interrupted the proceedings with loud cries for justice. She was sternly bidden to be silent and reproachfully told that she came there every day. And so I will, she cried out, until the qadi hears me. At length, at the end of a suit, the judge impatiently demanded, what on earth does that woman want? Her story was soon told. Her only son had been taken for a soldier, and she had been left alone and could not till her piece of ground. Yet the tax gatherer had forced her to pay the tax from which she, as a lone widow, could be exempt. The judge asked a few questions and said, well, let her be exempt. Thus, her perseverance was rewarded. Had she had the money to fee a clerk, she might have been excused long before. So that tale gives us a sense of the context of the story, how it might have arisen. a familiar problem for widows down through the centuries. But as Kate said last week in her sermon, parables are everyday stories, very familiar to Jesus' listeners, things that they would have seen and heard more than once. But then his stories are turned upside down and used to drive home his teaching. In Luke's parable, the widow is rewarded for her persistence, like the tale from the 1800s. The judge says, "I give in. Because this widow keeps bothering me, so she doesn't wear me out, I will give in to her." Now, the literal translation of bothering her and wearing her out would be more, "so she doesn't give me a black eye by punching me," in the sense of a boxer punching away, pummeling. So there's some humour here to imagine the judge being pummeled by a mere widow. So the judge grants her request, and Jesus says if a lousy judge eventually responds, God's not going to be like that. God will not delay. Commentators have lots to say about this parable, trying to avoid the problem. Well, we all know God doesn't answer our prayers just because we nag endlessly. We know that, right? We've tried that. We've tried nagging God and it doesn't work. So the writers try and say positive things about prayer not being a list of things we give to God, but more of a way of life. Our prayers do not constitute so many unanswered pleas. Rather, they are our participation in the reign of God. By praying continually and not giving up hope, we live in the surety that God has not abandoned the world. Barbara Brown Taylor says the widow was willing to say what she wanted out loud day and night over and over, whether she got it or not, because saying it was how she remembered who she was. It was how she remembered the shape of her heart. So that's some wonderful descriptions of prayer being about the way prayer shapes our lives, how we stay focused on God and God's world. We pray constantly. We try not to lose heart. While these scholars make very good points about prayer, it still feels to me like a burden. Is it really up to us to pray so much and pummel God so God might listen? Does that really shape our lives? So remembering that Jesus never accepted the status quo and always turned things upside down, what if we flip the story? What if we see ourselves as the judge and God as the widow? Debbie Thomas says, what if I am the judge and God, the pleading, persistent one, is the widow? The widow knocking down my door in the hopes that I will soften my heart and attend to the pain, injustice and sorrow which is wounding God's very being. The truth is, she says, the judge lives in me. And if the parable has anything to offer, it is that prayer alone will wear down my inner judge. It is through persistent prayer that my heart will finally soften. So what if God is pummeling us to get our attention? What if God is wrestling with us like the angel wrestling with Jacob in our first reading? Jacob was no saint. He double-crossed, he stole, he manipulated. And a man or an angel or God wrestles with him all night, wounds him and gives him a new name, just like the widow wrestling with the judge who comes to his senses and grants justice. The parable seems clearer to me that way around. And then we can also join the widow, God, the Spirit, in demanding justice and action on all of those things that make us lose hope. The Ukraine, the climate crisis, poverty, lack of homes. If we can be changed ourselves, well then, we can join God's work for change in our world. The last line of the reading is a winsome Jesus asking, "But when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" For Luke's community, the Son of Man they were hoping he was going to return. The return of the Son of Man was something they fervently hoped for. But if Jesus returned, would he find faith? Would he find his followers open and receptive to the Spirit, open to being challenged, open to growth in their lives of faith? Would he find followers who were persistent in prayer and open to God, who is also persistently pummeling them? Would he find followers acting with the Spirit in the world? Debbie Thomas asks, will Jesus find faith that persists, faith that contends, faith that wrestles? Faith that persists, faith that contends, faith that wrestles. Now that is something I think we can aspire to. In our daily lives, we can be open to the Spirit's nudging and guiding, prompting us to opt for compassion and justice rather than judgment and closed assumptions. Our Sunday liturgy each week sends us out to seek the Spirit of God who is alive in our land. Maybe this week it should carry a health warning. Watch out for pummeling and black eyes. Because the Spirit this week will wrestle with us and demand to be heard. Jesus asks us to engage with that Spirit and allow ourselves to be disrupted and changed by our prayer in order that he might find faith on earth.